Welcome to Investing in Integrity. I'm Ross Overline, CEO and co-founder of Scholars of Finance, a rapidly growing organization on a mission to inspire character and integrity in the finance leaders of tomorrow. If you're an investor, finance professional, or student aspiring to make an impact with capital, this show is for you. Investing in Integrity brings you conversations with leading minds in finance to help you learn how you can make finance a force for good by investing in integrity. And today we have with us John Taft, the Vice Chairman of Baird and one of the advisory board members, founding advisory board members of Scholars of Finance with us. John, it's great to have you today.
Great to be here, Ross. Thank you.
Absolutely. How are you holding up over there? Are you still in Florida?
No, I came back to my home state of Minnesota, and I must say I timed it perfectly because the sun is shining. We're going to have 70 degrees over Easter weekend.
Amazing. A treat, especially in Minnesota, to have that kind of weather. I'm happy to hear it. John, I'm so excited to have you on the Investing in Integrity podcast today. And I'm sure our audience and our listeners are going to be just thrilled to hear from you too directly, just given your career and your background. Why don't you just start us off by just sharing with our audience a little bit about your history, your background, and where you're coming from in this conversation?
Sure. Well, I think what everybody is interested in is that I am the descendant of William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, and part of a family legacy that goes back to his father, who was Attorney General of the United States, all the way down until my generation, where my cousin was actually two-term governor of Ohio. So 6-7 generations of political and public service to the United States, which has informed my own point of view around what I should be doing with my life. I started out wanting to be a newspaper reporter, was a comparative literature major at Yale, and had an experience covering the redevelopment of a city in northeastern Massachusetts that really changed my view of what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to commit myself to helping make communities more livable, more vital for the people who lived there. And so I went back to graduate school and I got into finance and have now spent 40 years in a profession that I never thought I would participate in 10 years chunks, it seems, 10 years in public finance with Piper Jaffray, 10 years in privately held asset management business called Voyager Asset Management, 10 years at RBC running their wealth management business, and now as vice chairman at Baird.
Thanks, John. Always love hearing your story and the path that you've taken. I think for most people in the financial services industry, the path is quite linear, and your journey going into finance, going into public service, exploring a few different venues, both in the public sector and in the private sector, and then of course to what's been a very, very successful career in financial services is, I think, an inspiration to me, definitely as a CEO here at Scholars of Finance, and I'm sure to a lot of our listeners. I think back to when we
Ross,
first
let me interrupt you there because you're right. I did interrupt my career in finance to be an aide to the mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota, which was at the time confusing to a lot of the people I was working with. But as I look back on it, one of the most important things I ever did. The second thing is throughout my career in finance, I have been involved in, a dozen or more not-for-profit organizations. And that, too, has been incredibly important influence on my career and what I care about. So the non-linearity of one's career can actually be quite important in broadening your interests and helping you explore and discover what is important to you.
I am really grateful that you built upon that and shared all of your public service. Scholars of Finance is definitely very, very grateful. All of us are very grateful to be one of the recipients of your public service and over the last several years. And this actually goes back to what I want to talk about first is when we first met, the first time that we connected. I remember it was Andrew Duff, who was then CEO and chairman at Piper Jaffray at the time, said, "Hey, would love to talk about principal leadership in finance." When I had sort of pitched this initial thinking of Scholars of Finance, there's another person who you should reach out to who would absolutely love this. His name is John Taft. That time you were the CEO of course, RBC's wealth management division, an incredibly large firm, of course, with hundreds of billions of dollars of assets, thousands of employees, around 2,000 financial advisors at the time. And I remember reaching out to you, feeling a little bit intimidated, and when you immediately responded and said, "I'd love to speak on this topic." I shortly thereafter, of course, ordered your book, and I ordered Stewardship. And I remember I was on a flight reading Stewardship out to the East Coast, and I read it during my whole trip there. I was there for some personal visits, and I remember getting back. And when we first met, I had already read the book, and I was absolutely floored by the this notion of stewardship. And your book, Stewardship, really has informed the mission of what Scholars of Finance is today. I would just love if you can share a bit about the book and sort of the philosophy of stewardship with the audience for us today.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me say one of the most gratifying things and surprising things in my career in finance has been the influence that stewardship has had on scholars of finance, and I hope through scholars of finance, on future generations of leaders in our industry. I mean, if the book is really about a couple of things. It's about the importance of core principles on a personal level, on a corporate level, industry sector level, and societal level, the importance of core principles. And my own journey to discover that my core principle, the solid ground on which I stand, is the principle of stewardship, which is the notion that our purpose on earth, if you will, is to manage whatever we're doing responsibly for the benefit of others. And the word stewards were, they're secular. There's secular origins for it. Those were the people who would manage the kingdom while the king or queen went off to fight wars or find a spouse or whatever, responsibly managing the kingdom in the absence of the king or queen. And then there's, of course, a religious element to it, which is the notion that we are all stewards of God's planet. We have a responsibility to God for stewarding the planet into the future. So there are a couple of sources of that, and it took me until into my 50s really before I realized how important that core principle was. The second thing that the book about is the role of finance, and the hypothesis behind the book and the argument that it makes is that stewardship is the core principle that should animate and inform the financial services industry when we're doing what society expects us to do. So those are the two things I think that really are embedded in the book that I would hope any reader would take away from it.
Could you have ever imagined that the book would inspire and almost result in a national organization of young people all trying to become stewards? So that meet or exceed your expectations?
Well, never dawned on me. I hope the book would be helpful in a bunch of different ways, but that was one I never anticipated. And I hope that at some point, Stewardship, my book, is superseded by a book that's written by somebody much younger than me that becomes the replacement seminal text for your organization.
Maybe that actually segues into a question I was wanting to ask. I remember you and I were we had just had dinner, and we were driving you back to your home in Minneapolis, and we were chatting on the drive. This was a couple of winters ago, and you were sharing that you were considering writing Stewardship 2.0 one day. Would love to hear an update on that and what that might entail and what the thinking might be.
Well, the first book, Stewardship, focused on the failures that led to the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, which I again posited were stewardship failures. Failures of people in the financial services industry to responsibly manage what others, our clients and society, had entrusted to our care, which is really the well-being of the economic system on which everything in our lives depends. But I said I suggested that there were nascent, emerging stewardship failures in other areas as well, and said that the financial crisis was sort of like a sneak preview or a case study in what happens when you do fail to act responsibly as responsible stewards. And the areas that I pointed to were climate change, to income inequality, which I didn't talk about in terms of racial disparities and the racial aspects of income inequality. And then the third was just the public finances of the United States. And since I wrote the book, I would argue that the last 10 years have just been a further demonstration of stewardship failure in those three areas. And unfortunately, I wrote that I thought that might lead to crises that made the financial crisis look like child's play. And so if you think about what could happen with climate change, what could happen with income inequality, and the social unrest that it's causing, and what could happen with a deteriorating financial condition of the United States of America as we borrow, and borrow, I think the book was prescient in that regard. So my book would be Stewardship 2.0, a call to step up and address these and other issues, societal challenges, in ways that would demonstrate stewardship responsibility and help avoid crises down the road.
Definitely think that now could be the right time. We'll get into it later with the Robinhood and GameStop fiasco, the potential legislation stemming from the narratives around it, and many other recent events. But when you talk about this notion of how financial services, how investors can make a positive difference, can address some of these problems, it opens up so many questions that I want to dig into with you. Recently, I've been thinking a lot about personally what areas of finance, what types of investment vehicles, what types of activity actually create value, long-term value for as many stakeholders as possible, versus what activities are purely extractive, or what activities are just purely exchanging or extracting value and not creating value. And one of our other advisors, JC DeSwan, who I've spoken to recently, he wrote a book, Seeking Virtue in Finance. He actually references you, and we talked about you quite a bit in our conversation. Sort of stewardship and some of your work really inspired him as well. And he was sort of making this case that venture capital, private equity, and activist investing are sort of three of the vehicles where you can create the most good, right? Through venture capital, you can actually direct the development of industries and allocate capital towards growing a business that makes an impact. In private equity, you can even help grow businesses through less of a traditional approach, but you can grow businesses that do good, drive efficiencies, drive growth, make those services more readily available to more people. And of course, through activist investing, there's an opportunity to really heavily influence the actions of corporate players, whether driving them towards ESG criteria, towards more sustainable practices, treating their employees better, making sure that their products are actually serving their customers and not just, again, extracting value or harming them. And I'm curious to hear your take on how we can leverage finance as a force for good. The title of your second book, how can finance be a force for good today, in your opinion?
Well, I would say you said so many thoughts and ideas. Let me put a few on the table. But number one, any time the financial services industry, financial services firms, markets, tools, products, capabilities are helping real people in the real world address real problems or achieve real things, then finance has the opportunity to be a force for good. I mean, if you think about it, our core purpose is to enable the flow of capital from asset owners, investors of all kinds, to productive enterprises of all kinds, manage the risks inherent in doing that, and do it in a way so that the economy grows, society is improved, and everybody's standard of living is increased. And then that's what we want from finance. And when you go in, I mean, if you look at the history of our industry, there are lots of products, if you want to take that for example, or services or capabilities that have the potential to be forces for good or forces for destruction. Now, a classic example of that was the innovation that one of my fellow board members at the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association was responsible for developing credit default swaps so that anyone could hedge the credit risk inherent in exposing themselves to another entity. And the whole notion of credit default swaps is a force for good neutral. It can be used for lots of good purposes. What happened was it got, quite frankly, corrupted. So people started leveraging credit default swaps. They stopped using them as ways to manage their risks in their operating businesses or whatever in the real world, and they started using it for speculation and therefore turned something that could serve a positive role in society into something that led to many of the excesses that we had to unwind during and after the financial crisis. So I think it's important for everyone to keep their eye on an innovation, if there is one, or a product and service, and make sure that it is actually serving real people in the real world and helping make the world a better place. If it's not, then I would scratch my head and say, well, then why are we doing that? So, we can possibly get into specific examples, but you want to talk about GameStop and Robinhood. I mean, Robinhood is an online commission-free trading platform that has gone to market and will be launching an IPO under the banner of democratizing finance, making equity investment available to people who otherwise couldn't afford to or wouldn't be interested in it. Okay, force for good. What we've seen, however, in the not too distant past is a way something like that can be perverted. I don't know what the right word, corrupted, sounds too intentionally evil, but can be used for other purposes that have nothing to do with democratizing finance, but are about all sorts of other things. So I think there are lots of examples today that you can look to in the marketplace and say, okay, these things are really good. One of them is the evolving. Well, it's more than evolving. It is a tidal wave of interest in socially responsible investing of various kinds. And what's happening is that, again, people with capital, investors, are increasingly putting their hands in the air and saying, hey, listen, we, for a bunch of reasons, maybe it's a new awareness that we have to address some of these societal issues or we're all going to be in deep trouble. They're putting their hands in the air and they're saying, we want to invest for purposes other than mere financial return. We want to invest in a way that addresses some of these societal problems we talked about earlier. Now, the financial services industry is coming to the table and saying, okay, we will develop ways for you to do that. And we will put you in touch with the kinds of organizations that are doing the things that you want to support. And so that's where you're seeing this swell of ESG, impact investing, positive and negative screening techniques, services, products, and investment vehicles in the socially responsible investing space. Now that's all good. Then little people are chirping though, saying, I think some of these socially responsible investment vehicles might not be all that socially responsible. They might just be saying that they're socially responsible in a way that misleads investors. And there's enough of that chirping out there right now that the SEC is even investigating what's called greenwashing, which is taking a marketing can of green paint and painting over whatever traditional investment vehicle you have and saying this is a green investment vehicle. So ESG, though, is something going on that I think is an enormous force for good. And related to that, I know I'm running on here. I just wrote a blog on climate finance. If we want to help the world transition to a carbon-free economy, keep global temperatures below levels that will, render the human species extinct, then we are going to need hundreds of trillions of dollars. Biden just put out a request for about $2 trillion in infrastructure spending over 10 years. Well, over the next several decades, we're going to need $150 trillion of capital to decarbonize the world's economy. That will require an entirely new market structure, new types of capital that are willing to absorb the risk over very long periods of time. I mean, we're talking about decades. So the whole notion of climate finance enabling the transformation of our economy is a very exciting area where finance has a center seat to saving the planet, literally sitting in the middle of the front row and essential to doing that. So I've rambled on here a little bit, but those are some ways in which I think exciting, positive developments are evolving in the financial services industry.
First and foremost, I will say I don't think you're rambling in any way, in any shape or form. I'm personally in rapt attention, and I'm sure those that are listening are taking notes and have 100 follow-up questions just like I do. And I saw your recent article that you just published on climate finance. Appreciate you sharing the slide from BCG explaining the climate finance market structure and what that will look like over the long term. And one thing I want to point out is you explaining and showing that this explaining the data and what you're hearing in the street, what others are saying, that it will take 100 to 150 trillion dollars, or $3 to $5 trillion annually, over the next several decades to try to make this transition. Um, I think creates the picture and actually captures quite well what we oftentimes talk to our students about. And also increasingly the analysts, the associates, the VPs, the managing directors, the CFOs and CEOs like yourself, who are getting involved in Scholars of Finance, which is that finance does have a central seat in this. A lot of the major problems that we're so passionate about these days, many of us are passionate about, like climate change, like mental illness, like poverty, like racial injustice and socioeconomic inequality and inequity. These are not problems that you start a nonprofit and solve with a few $1 million, or you start a company and solve raising a little bit of VC funding. Some of these problems are, I usually will say, billions or even trillions of dollar problems, but the order of magnitude, 150 trillion dollars. It's hard to even imagine, I think, for the individual, for me even, what that looks like, and clearly represents a transformation of society. And when you look at where capital resources lie in the U.S., a statistic that I'll often cite to our students is that in the United States, 80% of capital lies within the private sector. The other 20% is within government or NGOs. So the lion's share of capital is in the private sector, and increasingly the private sector is financialized, or private and public businesses have, of course, public businesses serve at the behest of their board, who are fiduciaries and have responsibility for the shareholders, the investors. And increasingly, through what I would call the democratization of angel investing, seed investing, crowdfunding, even more private businesses now have cap tables, right, and have investors who have expectations. So I think the role of the finance executive, the investor, is becoming increasingly important. And I appreciate you sharing just how large the problems are, but also the resources needed are, and making the really, really clear, painting a very clear picture of why finance is the industry, why investors are the people who need to step up to that challenge, of course, alongside the public sector. And I have so many questions about what you just shared. When you think about the kind of capital that we need to solve some problems, one thing that always interests me is how capital flows in through different types of investment vehicles. Like you actually mentioned credit default swaps earlier in your comments, saying that they were sort of, force for good neutral, but then they ended up not being corrupted. They turned bad. And I actually thought about derivatives.
Were used inappropriately.
Were used inappropriately. And I actually thought about derivatives, right, futures, back when they were initially created so that farmers, right, especially in corn and other industries, could hedge pricing risk when they were selling their crops. This helped, as you said, real people in the real world with real opportunities and improve their quality of life. And now you look at what's happened with derivatives and options, with day trading, creating massive volatility, just extracting value from the markets, right? Actually having the vast majority of derivative and option activity having no material benefit to the world, at least as I understand. And I'd be curious to hear sort of your view on what are some of the, the hottest, most popular, or most broadly held financial instruments or products or vehicles that do good, that help real people in the real world with real opportunities. And then what are some of those that don't, that are purely extracting value? If you could maybe share a list of both. And the reason I ask the question is so that our listeners, our audience, especially our students, as they're thinking through their own investing personally, their own future financial activity, their own careers, they can have a sense of which way to arc their career so they can do the most good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, before I do that, I will do that. I want to build on something you said, which is, it is true that if you're trying to deploy capital to solve problems or to accomplish societally important goals, most of that capital has to come from private sources. And again, climate finance is a perfect example. The amount of money it will take to solve our climate problem is many times larger than the amount of money government it has available to throw at the problem. And we see that right now. I mean, 1.9 or $2 trillion is a lot of money in Biden's most recent infrastructure proposal, but it's a drop in the bucket versus what's needed to effectuate climate change. So I wanted to emphasize that. Secondly, what products are good? What are extracting value? Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. And I am a fan of a lot of traditional investing vehicles. I mean, I think that the financial system has done a pretty good job of supporting our economies over decades, over the last 100 years. Yes, with some significant bumps and valleys along the way, but done a pretty good job. I started my career in the municipal bond business, and these are, of course, bonds that have a maturity, and they usually have a fixed rate of interest that they pay, and the rate of interest is free from tax. Why? Because the bonds, by definition, the proceeds have to be used for some public purpose as defined in whatever law or portion of the tax code is applicable. So the original green bonds, the original social bonds, the original socially responsible way to invest was to buy a bond, the proceeds of which were going to be used in your local community to improve quality of the schools, to rebuild the bridge, to separate the sewer system so it wasn't dumping sewage and raw sewage into the river that ran through the community. I mean, these are all things that to build a new hospital, these are all things that I helped finance when I was in the industry, and those are still available today and will be even more important going forward, because a tremendous amount of the infrastructure that needs to be repaired is going to be financed with municipal bonds, both tax exempt and taxable. So that's one example of something that's adding value. Another old school investment vehicle that nobody thinks about, but provides a very interesting counterpoint to Robinhood and the GameStop short squeeze debacle we just went through, are employee stock purchase plans. And these are plans, they were actually introduced in the 1960s as part of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. They permit, if you work for a publicly traded company, it permits you to buy the stock of the publicly traded company at a 15% discount up to a limit. Happens to be $25,000. It was in the 60s. It is today, with no taxation on that discount currently. So it's a way to build value and manage risk, actually reduce risk if you're buying something at a 15% discount. So properly executed employee stock purchase plans could be a tremendous way for ordinary people, workers in publicly held companies, to build value. Well, to me, that's democratizing finance right there. And of course, the fabulous thing about the financial services industry, amount of innovation being used, there is a company backed by private equity firms, has come in and said, how can we help people use these plans more efficiently than they have in the past, because participation in them is very low. People don't have enough money to fully utilize them. So this firm comes in and offers employees who elect for this short-term loans, so that they can buy with, if all they can afford through payroll deductions is $1,000 worth of their company stock, they can sign up with this company, and the company will lend them interest-free, short-term, through the purchase period of the company's stock, the maximum amount they can buy under the plan, let's say $25,000. So they end up buying $25,000 worth of stock at a discount, instead of, and then the loan is repaid when the offering period is over. But they're able to increase their economic participation in the employee stock purchase plan. Well, that's democratizing finance, old school. So I love my personal favorite innovations out there are things that look to existing vehicles and adapt them for current needs and purposes. And in the case of the employee stock purchase plan, what is the need? The need is to try to fill the wealth gap. The people who don't have a lot of resources, have not been able to participate in the increased value of financial assets. Well, this would be a way, sort of leveraging their employee stock purchase plan participation would be a way to help fill that gap. So our industry is filled with things like that. That's one thing I love about it.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it. And if you had to give our listeners one or two products that you think are purely extractive, what might you say?
Okay, so I'm going to get in trouble for this, but
I don't want to put you in a rough spot here.
No, I'm just going to say I don't understand, so I'll put the problem back on me. I don't understand what social purpose high-frequency trading for one's own account serves. We're talking about, getting in front of other trades, trying to exploit tiny inefficiencies in nanoseconds. Also, you earn a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a penny on a trade. I suppose, you're quote unquote improving market efficiency, but boy, to me, that falls in the category of something that nobody would miss if it didn't exist. And in fact, we actually have some firms, some former colleagues of mine, set up a firm that actually slowed trades down. It was an exchange that slowed trades down coming in so that high-frequency traders couldn't take advantage of price discrepancies on their exchange. I thought that was a good sort of counter innovation. So that would be an example for something that I just think is extractive and is not helping anybody in the real world do anything the financial services system was supposed to do.
Yeah, I oftentimes wonder as well what high frequency trading is doing materially beyond the sort of age-old argument that it increases market efficiency. There's of course some benefit to that, but it when you think about the sort of impact that any kind of instrument could have in terms of its good, it definitely seems to me to be on the lower end. And I'm of course still learning more as well. One comment that you made that I want to follow up on.
Before you go on, I'm sorry. I do want to give voice, though, and there's some very smart people out there, who have written about, the big question, which is to what extent is the financial services industry extractive? To what extent is it adding value, and to what extent is it extracting value that could be directed elsewhere? And that gets to the whole question of what is the optimal size of the financial services industry relative to the overall global economy. And one of the things that is true is that the financial services industry as a percentage of GDP is much larger today than it was, decades ago. It's not as large a percentage of the economy as it was going into the financial crisis. That really is when it top ticked. And but is it if we reduced the financial services sector as a percentage of GDP, would we be better off or worse off? And there's some good arguments to make that we wouldn't be any worse off, which would argue that maybe we've gotten larger than we need to be to accomplish what society wants us to accomplish. And I think there is some, I'm not smart enough or well-schooled enough to know whether that's true, but I think it's an interesting area for exploration going forward, because an oversized financial services industry isn't ultimately in the best interests of society.
I couldn't agree more, and I think the sort of spectrum that I oftentimes find myself pondering, rather than sort of size and proportion of GDP, which I have looked at, and you can definitely see those trends where it's increased dramatically especially since the 1960s, 1970s, but is the spectrum between value adding and value extracting. A large financial services industry, if 80% of activity is just trading and extraction, does that do? But 20%, is additive. Is that better than a much smaller, a financial services industry, a quarter the size, where 100% of activity is actually value adding, is creating value, is growing GDP, like you said before.
That is a point that's been made.
One question I wanted to ask earlier was, you mentioned you sort of touched on wealth inequality, the wealth gap, and there's some even recent data that talks about this and digs into it. I saw a Forbes article actually last year titled "Most Americans Don't Have a Real Stake in the Stock Market," a very fitting title, and the author goes on to say that only 55% of Americans own stocks, according to an April 2020 poll by Gallup. And when you look at the latest government data available from the Federal Reserve from 2016, only 14% of American families are directly invested in individual stocks, but over 50% actually have some investment, usually through the form of retirement accounts, right?
Yep.
There was an NYU professor, Edward Wolf, who tracks wealth in America, and that even though half of all households own shares, the richest 10% of households in the U.S. controlled 84% of the total value of stocks in 2016.
Yeah. Yep.
So I'm curious, of course, inequality and equity, it's been at the forefront of people's minds, rightfully so. I want to hear your take on to what degree you think the financial system can address inequality and inequity in society, and how people in finance can lead the charge, or at least do their part.
The good news is I think there's a growing acknowledgement that there is a wealth gap, and there's a fair amount of energy around trying to address it. I mean, the example I gave of employee stock purchase plans and trying to increase participation in those would be one example, and the innovation somebody came up with, which is to help investors leverage whatever they can spend or workers to participate in buying their company stock. That's a good example. During the 2020 presidential campaign, Mayor Bloomberg, while he was still a candidate for president, actually put forth a proposal without any specifics, but it intrigued me, for using the Postal Service to deliver more basic financial services. You saw recently that Walmart hired one of the top executives in Goldman Sachs's push to launch Marcus, a sort of a mass affluent lending and wealth management capability that they've developed, hired them to do the same at Walmart. And I think that providing basic financial services to people who haven't had or haven't taken advantage of financial asset ownership, I think there's a lot of energy behind that. Now, none of these innovations do any good without a corresponding commitment to financial literacy. I mean, I don't know what the numbers would say, but the financial literacy of the American, the potential pool of investors in America is woefully inadequate. People simply don't understand financial markets, and they don't therefore know what they can be doing to increase their chances of accumulating wealth over the course of their lifetime. They don't understand how markets behave. So you constantly see all this suboptimal behavior on the part of small investors, buying high, selling low, trying to time the market, going from stocks to bonds at exactly the wrong time. All this activity that just further puts them into the hole that they're trying to climb out of. So I think financial literacy is something the industry needs to work on more. And as you know, Ross, the proceeds of my second book went 100% to a couple of financial literacy issues, organizations focused on improving financial literacy. And there are lots of organizations out there. I think they deserve more support from our industry. I think our industry can invest more in helping people understand financial markets, because it's sort of intimidating if you're not involved. The other challenge, though, in the whole inequality arena, and I've written about this, is the difficulty small businesses, particularly small businesses owned by minority entrepreneurs, and particularly small businesses owned by minority entrepreneurs in disadvantaged communities, the difficulty they have getting access to capital. And in fact, we're having a Minnesota sponsors every year a CFA Society event in April. We're in April now. For Putting Investors First is the name of the initiative. At any rate, we're going to be highlighting, or I'm going to be interviewing the founder of one of the longest standing and most effective community development finance organizations in the country, the Community Reinvestment Fund, USA, based in Minneapolis. And that's all they do. They're one of about 1,000 CDFIs in the country. There is a division of the Treasury Department that supports them nominally. But what they do is they provide capital to small businesses, minority-owned businesses, small minority-owned businesses in disadvantaged communities. And the founder of that, a longtime CEO, a guy named Frank Altman, has lots of good ideas about what can be done to improve the flow of capital through organizations like that to exactly the kind of people and businesses we want to support. And hopeful that the Biden administration is going to be a whole lot more supportive of the CDFI community in the country, which is still just a drop in the bucket relative to what's needed. But one out of the blue, Mackenzie Scott, so Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, came by and made a $15 million contribution to the CRF USA CDFI in Minnesota, which will take their capital from $35 million to $50 million, and is going to make a huge difference in the communities that they help, because they can leverage that many times over. So that's another area where finance could do more, is doing something. The alternative capital market to get capital to small businesses in disadvantaged communities.
I've got to say, it's incredibly encouraging to hear what you're seeing, and even some of the opportunities that you're engaging in. CDFIs, like you mentioned, financial literacy, as you mentioned, being something that you've invested really heavily in. As we've begun growing Scholars of Finance, I've been finding out that financial literacy is a much larger problem than I had been aware of. After doing some research, some of the students at chapters that we're now launching, especially some of our first gen low income students, have learned very little. They don't know a lot about what finance is, what it entails, how to manage your own personal finances. And so I think that the education is of those who don't have, generations of people who have had financial advisors, who have inherited wealth, et cetera, is going to be so crucial and so important. There's a couple other things that I've been seeing recently too that I've been excited about. I'll mention, I think, a couple at Andreessen Horowitz, one of the VC firms local to me out here in Silicon Valley. They have the Cultural Leadership Fund, right, where they're essentially partnering with cultural leaders to advance more African Americans into technology, which I've just thought was incredible. And they even just launched a new fund called the Talent X Opportunity Fund, right, where they are actually trying to bring capital to entrepreneurs, to young business owners who historically have not had opportunity, right? Who haven't been able to get access to the type of ecosystem and resources that so many others have, and actually building what is more or less the foundation that will build and grow upon itself. It's a donor advisory fund managed by Tides, and it will grow upon itself, continuing to bring capital to entrepreneurs who otherwise wouldn't have any opportunity. And it's exciting to see some of that, like you mentioned, in the entrepreneurial space. With just a few minutes left, I know we're coming up on time. Just maybe a last quick question for you. I wanted to ask you, John, with your decades of experience now in Wall Street and in finance, having worked your way up from analyst to CEO of multi-thousand person firm with hundreds of billions of dollars of assets under management, to now, of course, serving as vice chair of Baird. What sort of key advice that you think is timely and relevant to anyone who might be listening, who's whether a student interested in entering finance or a current finance professional or investor, might you offer? What can we do, as scholars of finance, if you will, to maximize our personal impact in today's current environment? What would you ask us to do or encourage us to do?
As you know, I support Scholars of Finance because I think you're incredibly impactful in helping to launch future leaders of our industry. And I think you're doing many of the things that need to be done to ensure that we have a new generation of ethical leaders of finance who are focused on the proper purpose of our industry, which is helping real people in the real world accomplish real things. A couple of things I would say. One is exposing people who want to get into the industry, both over the early years, where they're still in school, and early years of their career, to people like me, people who've been around. I think can be enormously helpful. I know that that when I was a new entrant into the industry, and my dad was a nuclear physicist. As I said, I was a literature major and a newspaper reporter. I didn't know a bond from a banana until I went to graduate school, and then I just learned what I learned in books. So when I came into the industry, looking around and saying, is this going to be for me, I would spot and focus on people who looked to me to be the kind of person I wanted to be down the road in the industry, and I would just watch them. Watch how they dress, watch how they comported themselves, watch what they did, and engage them in conversations. And really, Scholars of Finance does that for your membership. So that's number one. I also think that networking with their peers can be incredibly helpful. But fundamentally, okay, in this industry, there is so much stress, there is so much noise, there is so much volatility. There are days when you think you hung the moon and days when you really wonder whether you should go into the office or just start another career. The most important thing that sustains you over the course of a long career in finance, I believe, is having a series of maybe one core principles that you can anchor yourself with and stand on in good times and bad. And my personal one is the core principle of stewardship, the notion that I was put on the earth to help others, that it's not about me, it's about adding value and making the world a better place for other people. And I'm going to do that in my personal life, and I'm going to do that in my not-for-profit activities, and I'm going to do that in my community involvement, and I'm going to do that through my career in finance. So having a well-defined, internalized set of principles that you believe in no matter what. You may not have those today. It may take some extreme experiences to teach you what those are, but develop them, internalize them, and they will sustain you throughout what hopefully will be exciting, rewarding, and socially valuable careers in finance.
Amazing. Thanks, John. I'm inspired even hearing your closing remarks, and to all of our listeners, I hope that you are as well. John, I know we've come up to time, so just want to thank you so much for our conversation today. I've learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else has, and we can't wait to have you back on and see a lot more of you in Scholars of Finance here in the years ahead. And just want to thank you for sharing your insights, everything you've taught us, helping us see how we can invest with integrity, invest in integrity, how we can lead with character, and make a difference. Like you said, help real people in the real world with real opportunities. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Investing in Integrity by Scholars of Finance. I want to share a huge thank you to our advisors, directors, donors, team, and our members who make this all possible. If you like this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. And if you have any feedback for us, you can send it to hello@scholarsoffinance.org or by visiting our website. Until next time, please join us on our mission to inspire character and integrity in the finance leaders of tomorrow.